Before I forget, there are books for sale. The Coddling of the American Mind is for sale at a steep discount, I think, over here. If you want to buy a copy, if you're so inspired, and perhaps ask for an autograph, the bookstore has been very kind about bringing copies of our speaker's latest book. And also, please bear in mind, there are microphones here and here for a reason. We encourage substantial Q&A at these events. So as the lecture wraps up, feel free to line up at these mics and get your chance to say something and exercise your free speech. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gabriel Noah Brahm, professor of English and director of the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. The center is ecumenical. We aim to enhance the quality of life on campus for everyone by improving the quality of our public conversation, our shared conversation about important matters of common concern. We try to do that in three ways. We promote viewpoint diversity, we support open inquiry, and we celebrate excellence in higher education, scholarship, the life of the mind. That means we're an antidote to political correctness. We include conservative as well as liberal voices. We're an antidote to censorship, self-censorship, and groupthink. We stand for seeking the truth as a part of any university's core mission and speaking freely while doing so of necessity. We're an antidote, thirdly, to declining standards in the liberal arts, the social sciences, and the humanities. We bring only the best speakers, authors, public intellectuals to address our finest students and faculty and administration, staff, and community members. The fact that you're here tonight shows that you are the best because you really care about what Socrates said is most worth caring for in the living of a human life, the well-being of young souls. And as you know, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth, for harming the youth. And a part of his defense was to say, I harm the youth? What about the rest of you? How do you know what helps and what harms young people? He said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm glad you're concerned about this, but I'd like you to think more carefully about what it really means to help or harm young people. And that's our topic here tonight. And speaking of young souls, I will turn it over in just a minute to my research assistant, Mr. Timothy Eggert, to introduce tonight's special guest. Tim has been a great help to me all year. As this year's Peter White Scholar, it was part of my research program to build up the CAIF as a unique community resource, filling a pressing need for the defense and enrichment of academic and intellectual freedom on campus. Tim's shared commitment to these core values was a big part of our success and a big part of the success of my work as the Peter White Scholar. One last thing. If I don't see you at graduation, I look forward to seeing you next year when Deirdre McCloskey, the brilliant economist and longtime transgender rights activist, comes to the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom to discuss her work on the moral legitimacy of free market capitalism. And with that, I turn it over to Tim.
Hello, everyone. I'm Timothy Eggert. For those of you who don't know me already, I'm one of 3 undergraduate fellows working at the center this year, doing research, communicating to you all over email, and helping out with organizing these events. It's been a great year and a really amazing experience of the best that higher education has to offer. I want to just quickly thank Dr. Brahm for making possible a level of academic rigor I haven't found elsewhere, and for modeling what real dedication to the value of a liberal arts education looks like. I'd also like to acknowledge the CAIF's Board of Faculty Advisors and Dean Robert Wynn, whose support and encouragement has meant a lot all year. Another thank you goes out to the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University for a generous grant that helped make tonight's event possible. Our speaker tonight is an attorney, New York Times bestselling author, and president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, otherwise known as FIRE. He is the author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate, Freedom from Speech, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus. Most recently, he co-authored with Executive Director of Heterodox Academy Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. It's a highly regarded book that expands on their September 2015 Atlantic cover story of the same name. He is executive producer of the feature-length documentary film, Can We Take a Joke? A work that explores the rise of outrage culture and the concomitant decline of humor on our nation's college campuses. He has published essays and op-eds in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and other leading journals. He appears frequently on TV and radio, including the CBS Evening News, the Today Show, and NPR's Morning Edition. In 2008, he became the first ever recipient of the Playboy Foundation's Freedom of Expression Award, and has testified about free speech issues on America's college campuses before the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. He is the fifth and final speaker of the year in the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom's 2018-2019 series of lectures and seminars for students, faculty, administration, and the community that we call Safe Space for Open Inquiry. And I know I speak for Dr. Brahm as well as myself when I say we could not ask for a better, more appropriate symbol of what the CAVE stands for than we have with us tonight. I also think it's really important not only to the future of Northern, but to the future of our country that we hear what he has to say. For as he exhibits in his 2012 book, Unlearning Liberty, what happens on campus doesn't just stay on campus. It bleeds into the larger society. And what's been happening in recent years, as students of my generation know well, has not been all good. As our speaker himself puts it, modern universities are producing college graduates who lack the experience of uninhibited debate. As a result, our society is effectively unlearning liberty. Moreover, he goes on to say, presciently, this could have grave long-term consequences for all of our rights and the very cohesion of our nation. Sadly, we have witnessed the truth of this prediction, as intensified political correctness and reactions to it have indeed come to dominate our public sphere, our elections, the media, as well as our college classrooms. Ironically, as divisions in America grow sharper, the misguided campaign to shelter students from offensive speech and outrageous ideas increases in strength also. It's not helping. The truth is, we students are more resilient than some of us give credit for, than some give us credit for. If given a chance, we are ready to face the issues facing our society and to contribute to solving them. But to do that, we need to know what they are, and that means hearing from and engaging with all sides. We didn't come to college to be protected from ourselves by the thought police. And so, it is with my very great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Greg Lukianoff.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's a tough act to follow. So thank you so much to Northern. Thank you so much to Dr. Braun. Thank you so much to Tim. I had a little bit of an adventure getting here, so if I'm especially kooky or frazzled, I blame the fog. I got redirected to a different airport. But my job is actually pretty cool because I get to talk about my life's mission. I was the weird law student who went to law school. Is this working okay, or is it? Am I catching this one? Should I push that away? Can you all hear me? I was the weird law student who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. It was my love. I explain why to some degree in Unlearning Liberty. And I took every class that Stanford offered on First Amendment, and when I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. When I told one of my closest friends about it, he looked at me in horror and said, "Who's making you do that?" And I'm like, I made the project. It was my choice. And if you find something like that, that means that much to you, you should follow it if you're lucky enough to. So the beginning part of this presentation is actually going to be something that I just recently added, particularly after a very disappointing trip to Haverford College outside of Pennsylvania, where I was told by the director of the program there that people just were giving up on talking to each other. That essentially it reached the point where it was just people just thought it was better to keep quiet, not really disagree on stuff, and it was palpable in the room. And I felt like I really had to give Free Speech 101 because I feel like they don't get it in other places. So okay, let's take the big view of human history, which I like to. This is what we, and by we I mean our species, in almost every culture, handled dissenters historically. And I'm going to focus on some heroes in Europe. We make them take hemlock. We burn them at the stake. And who knows who this is? Any guesses? Giordano Bruno, burned alive in 1600, partially for speculating very nerdily about the possibility of life on other planets, which in my book makes them super cool. And of course, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, we even would crucify people for opposing the state. As some theories goes, were being blasphemers, which were very close to the same thing in the past. And understanding this history, it's why you really have to get the audacity of the First Amendment. The First Amendment, in just a handful of words, tries to say, in our country, we are not going to fight over opinions and speech. The press will be free to associate, and you will be allowed to practice whatever religion you choose, and the state will not impose its religion on you. Now, that sometimes is presented as sort of a conservative revolution because it wasn't as wackadoodle as the French Revolution. But I think of that as incredibly audacious because in one line, someone was trying to just put down on paper, we're not going to kill each other over this anymore. We're going to try to have a society where rather than burn or murder or poison people who we dissent with, we're going to let them be. And actually, you know what? We might even listen to them sometimes. That's a radical idea, but it changed the world as it was practiced. And the funny thing is, I want to write about this at some point, but it seems like free speech was a condition that was a necessary evil, I think people thought in Europe, because nobody could conquer the whole thing. But then they started to realize it had real benefits. Turns out, people who aren't your kin sometimes have good ideas. But this is the way it's presented, I think, in high schools and campuses these days. Free speech protects the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. My assistant chose Tony Stark, knowing I'm a comic book nerd, so I was so psyched when he chose that. And I have to explain this very basic thing. The robber baron, historically, is protected by the fact he's rich. Rich people in history generally do fine. They don't need a special amendment to protect them. The bully and the bigot generally don't have a lot of power unless they're in the majority. Unless they actually have that 51%, the bully and the bigot, can't really decide what's going on. But that possibility that, because at first James Madison, when he was considering the First Amendment, he's like, whose power are we limiting here? We're limiting our own power? This is our elected government. Why would we want to, just like they argue in Parliament, so we're going to limit our own ability to choose? And it took people like George Mason to convince James Madison of the wisdom of it, because what you didn't want was a back and forth, a teeter-totter of every time you got to 51%, you got to arrest your enemies. And that's where the First Amendment come from. But by definition, it's not about protecting the majority. In a democracy, the majority is protected by the fact it's a majority. What freedom of speech, what the First Amendment protects necessarily then, particularly in a democracy, are minorities, both literal and numerical. Some of the biggest champions of freedom of speech have been people like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is not an incidental figure in the history of freedom of speech. He's one of the great thinkers of freedom of speech. Ida B. Wells, as you see in here, also championed of freedom of speech. She fought segregation in the South by reporting on it. And the person in the middle is a gay rights champion who, the name is currently escaping me, Flight, and who was one of the biggest free speech champions of Frank Kameny, Frank Kameny in the middle, and he was fired from his job. He was a scientist, he was an astronomer working for the government, and he was fired from his job for being gay in the 1950s. And he always invited people, if he was going to shout, people could shout back. Frank Kameny is someone who should be a household name. So by definition, freedom of speech exists for the underdog, the oddball, the eccentric, the person who wants to go their own way, the person who is not in the majority, the person who feels downtrodden. That's what it exists for. But unfortunately, because campuses frankly tend to be so monolithic and people think that everyone agrees, there's a sense that, power will always be on my side. Power will do the right thing if I can just guilt them into doing it, without realizing that the more power you give to power, the less, ultimately, the people that it's going to harm in the long run are minorities, are oddballs, are free thinkers. And I see this time and time again in my work. Now, it's also, by the way, I feel like almost a non sequitur to what I do, because I get invited to all these campuses to sit on panels and talk about hate speech. And people are like, the problem of hate speech, Greg Lukianoff, believes that hate speech should be protected. And of course, my answer is, well, it is protected, very clearly. There's no principled way to sort of distinguish, opinions that are hateful from other ones, in my opinion. But what does this have to do with most of what I see on campus? And I'm going to explain what I mean. So this is the very practical, brass tacks of what I do. FIRE is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. We're having Salman Rushdie come and speak at a dinner we're doing in New York. And you learn a lot of things just by being on the ground. Of getting, we get about 1,000 case submissions a year from students and professors all over the country. And then I go to conferences and people have these stereotypes about what it actually looks like on campus. And I have to say, it's like, and usually it's some kind of like simple moral story. It's sort of like a evil conservative against the nice left-leaning students, or in the other version, it's the good students fighting the racists and the bigots. But these are more like the cases I deal with on a daily basis. Now, so I'm going to talk about factors in what I see the important elements in my work. And one of them is, of course, political correctness. A term I don't love all that much because I feel like it means such different things to liberals and conservatives that it's almost, it's not quite useless though. Basically, like I think of it as a kind of sort of uptightness, like this idea that we're being too restrictive in what we're saying. We're being dominated by an idea of correctness. And the cases that I see that most remind me of political correctness, again, don't really look like the stereotype. So in the upper corner right there, that's the great Chris Lee. He is a student who tried to do a musical comedy called The Passion of the Musical, which was a comedy based on the Passion of the Christ. So you're getting in dangerous territory right there, with the stated goal of offending everybody on campus. They literally put on the tickets, "Do not come to this show if you're easily offended. My goal is to offend everybody." He said this everywhere. He actually came out in the front to talk before. It's like, guys, this is like South Park. We're going to try to and he was a sociology student, so he really was trying to think of every possible sort of joke. And the police at University of Washington, the administration worked with students, and they told them the angry students to come to the show, stand up, and start yelling they're offended. And turns out it's not such a great idea to organize an angry mob to go to anything, because then they start shouting death threats. And the University of Washington police tell Chris, "We're not going to protect you if you go ahead with your planned show. So it's one of the worst cases. We talk about it a lot in Can We Take a Joke? Next to him, on the top corner, that's Zach Wood. He's from Williams College. He ran a program called Uncomfortable Learning. That's kind of gives you the idea of what it's about. I was invited to speak there. I don't think I'm that uncomfortable. But he wanted to invite John Derbyshire. And John Derbyshire is a pretty famous intellectual. He wrote a book on a famous mathematician, and he was fired from National Review for writing some stuff that I think it's safe to say was racist in another publication. And Zach Wood wanted to invite John Derbyshire to campus to debate him. And he was told that he couldn't. And it's, of course, when you look at sort of like the identity politics element of this is a black student being told by a white upper-class university president that you can't actually have this debate on my campus. So it doesn't fit the stereotypes. The middle one is actually probably like, this is more what Juan Williams means when he talks about political correctness on the right. This is a student who was actually trying to hand out, what do you call it, flyers that said "Down with Capitalism." It's so old-timey. It's adorable. It's like 100 years ago, kind of like freedom of speech. And she was arrested at Joliet Junior College. We defended her. We were like, "You arrested somebody for handing out, anti-capitalism flyers?" Here are the following like 50 cases that say you can't do that. And in the bottom two corners, and who recognizes the legs in this picture? Anybody know what that's from? What's it from? What's that? Patch Adams, okay. So Patch Adams, if anybody remembers, this was a Robin Williams sort of saccharine vehicle, PG-13 at most. I think it was actually just PG. And this is about this, loving clown character who's a very compassionate doctor, but he also is a prankster. So for the opening of the gynecology clinic, he puts up this welcome gynos to your cervix thing. And students at University of Alaska at Fairbanks, these two students, again, not fitting the stereotype, they were investigated for sexual harassment for putting up this PG-13 image in their comedy edition. A lot of student newspapers do a comedy edition on April Fool's Day. And they were investigated for a year trying to figure out if this picture harassed the entire community of University of Alaska at Fairbanks. It's pretty safe to say it didn't. So political correctness is a factor, but it's not as big of a factor sometimes as you might think, because an awful lot of what we end up dealing with on campus, as someone knows this one, that we end up dealing with on campus is actually just over-bureaucratization. It comes from administrative efforts to control the environment more than it probably should be. And this is definitely a case where that's pretty clear. Anybody familiar with this one? Okay, so Constitution Day is the day after my birthday. It's September 17th. And this is a student who's a Afghanistan and Iraq vet, but nicest, most soft-spoken kid you ever met in your life. He's like, you know what? My school is really overregulated. I bet I couldn't even hand out copies of the freaking Constitution on Constitution Day on my campus in California, in an open area. I worked for the ACLU of Northern California briefly, and I have to tell you, this is not a close call. You can do this. Even a non-student could do this. And immediately, within 10 minutes, he's approached by a campus police officer, giving him lots of different reasons for why he can't do this. And meanwhile, this kid is going, I'm holding the First Amendment literally in my hands right now, and you're telling me I can't do this. But he's a nice kid, like I said. So he goes and he talks to this nice administrator, and she explains, like, listen, there's a free speech area. It's a concrete area over there. You're only allowed to have free speech in that area. But let's look in this binder. It's not available today. So can you celebrate Constitution Day in October? Yeah, it's an amazing case, and I was really glad he got it all on video. It's kind of funny because people saw this and like, surely fire set this up. And my response is, I wish we set this up. Like, this is a student's own initiative. So free speech zones are at least used to be amazingly common. We're starting to turn the tide as best we can tell. And so I just want to give you, and this is a lot of what happens in my day-to-day work. So even if you think hate speech should be protected on campus, that opinion's irrelevant to a lot of what we end up fighting on campus. So this one here is one of my all-time favorites. It's the infamous free speech gazebo at Texas Tech University. 20 feet wide of freedom for all 28,000 students at Texas Tech University. I had one of my friends, and this is true, this is in my book on Learning Liberty, do the dimensional analysis of this, and if, God forbid, all 28,000 students wanted to exercise their free speech rights at once, you would have to crush them down to the density of uranium-238. Above it, next to it, is the famous free speech swamp at University of Hawaii Hilo. I saw this myself. I was not willing to go down into the free speech swamp because I thought I might be electrocuted, given there's like all this electrical stuff down there. These were students who were trying to also hand out the Constitution and protest the NSA. When they tried to do this, by the way, they were told by an administrator, "You can't do this. That's not the 60s anymore," which was like, nice fact for a lawsuit to have someone actually saying that. To University of Hawaii Hilo's credit, they actually did a great job of working with us after we filed the lawsuit, and there are now no free speech zones at University of Hawaii. Students have the right to be in the public area at Hawaiian campuses and hand out constitutions and protest the NSA all they want, which is great. Above it is a University of Cincinnati. That green push pin that we put there is about 50 times the size of the actual free speech zone that we're pointing to. And students were told that they would be arrested for trespassing if they were seen on campus trying to, how should I put this, petition the government for redress of grievances. They were trying to actually get a petition signed for a ballot initiative, and they, by the rules at the University of Cincinnati, they had to take 2 weeks. They had to get 2 weeks advance permission in order to engage in really, really clearly protected speech. And they were told they'd be arrested for trespass. The first judge we got in front of this was not happy. And the top corner, first but not least, is just the saddest little free speech zone I've ever seen. This is at Bryn College in Texas. And to understand that the free speech zone is not the whole picture, the whole beautiful picture. It's actually just the 2 squares on either sides of that sad little bulletin board. That's another one that we fought and defeated. So a lot of these cases they aren't what you think, and they don't have to. It doesn't have to be like this. So speech codes. Hopefully, you've heard a lot about speech codes. When I first started doing this work, a lot of people thought speech codes on campuses were, a product of the 1980s or 90s, of the heyday when those of us who were around then first started hearing the term political correctness, and they just kind of went out of existence. But turns out they're still around. And for example, of just a really vague and broad one, University of West Alabama to this day still bans technically harsh text messages or emails. Harsh. The definition of vague and broad. Whenever I tell students about this, it's like, so who in here has never arguably sent a harsh email or text message? And do you really want administrators to have the power to punish you for that? But below it is the all-time classic, the ban on the use of derogatory names, inconsiderate jokes, and inappropriately directed laughter. Be careful. This was first defeated at University of Connecticut, my home state, in 1990. And it was laughed at, I think inappropriately, they might say, in the student in the national media and the student media, of course. And what's amazing about this, why it doesn't say University of Connecticut, it says Drexel, because this whole policy was actually found alive and well at Drexel University in 2006. And the only way I could figure out that an administrator got their hands on this was possibly by Googling most laughably unconstitutional policy ever to be applied at a school and just cutting and pasting it into their policy. So at Drexel University, with the help of students, we got this code repealed. And that's actually a story of where we've had a lot of success. Whereas when we first started evaluating about 400 schools for speech codes, about 75% of them had what we call red light speech codes. An example of a red light speech code is like inconsiderate, inappropriately directed laughing. But with 70 plus lawsuits and a speech code of the month every month since 2005, and they still continue to be pretty ridiculous, we've managed to actually get the number of red light schools down below 30%, which is pretty good. Yellows are up. Yellows aren't that bad. And the good news is we've got greens to an all-time high. When we first started, we had about 7 green light schools. We now have in the 40s, which is pretty nice. So we're actually making progress there. But then comes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this progression later, but then comes kind of like the new breed of speech codes, which I didn't really see coming. And this is still policy at University of California, not just at UCLA, but at a number of schools. where they define microaggressions, a tiny form of violence against the oppressed, as including things, statements like, where are you from or where are you born? As a first-generation American, my mother is English, my father is Russian. That's one of the most standard questions anybody asked in my neighborhood, partially because a lot of us were first-generation or immigrants ourselves. I believe the most qualified person should get the job. America is a land of opportunity. America is a melting pot, or affirmative action is racist. I gotta tell you, if you go to law school, for example, you're gonna read court opinions in which that's the major argument. So whether you like these statements, I don't know if people are highly offended by these statements. I'm not. But these are said to be microaggressions. Again, tiny forms of violence against the oppressed. And one of the things that I always like to emphasize is I actually think microaggressions are incredibly interesting. I think microaggressions are things that absolutely should be academically studied. How do we unintentionally slight each other is an incredibly interesting academic idea, and how we can do better is very important. But as soon as it gets in the hands of administrators, unfortunately, it becomes a code that basically says, I don't like it when people say the following things. So what's another factor? Federal government. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this has actually improved in the past couple of years. The Department of Education has actually repealed some of its worst guidance. But during a period, starting about 2011, running to about 2016, we started seeing really bad policies coming out of the Department of Education. Really vague standards for harassment, for discrimination. And Laura Kipnis, who's a feminist professor at Northwestern University, wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is one of the biggest publications for people in academia. And what she wrote was that Title IX is actually now being written in such a vague and broad way that it's paternalizing to women, and she objected to that as a feminist, and that it's squelching speech. And she mentioned a lawsuit against Northwestern University against a professor. She didn't mention the people involved in it. And after the article came out, the next day, she got a note that she was now under investigation for violating Title IX at Northwestern University for writing the op-ed saying that Title IX crushed free speech. So she was investigated for 72 days. She wasn't allowed to know who was charging her. She wasn't allowed to know what the charges were. She wasn't allowed to consult an attorney. She wasn't allowed to talk about it publicly. And maybe this sounds horrifying to most. I hope it sounds horrifying to most of you. If not, that worries me. But you should know, from being on the ground for years, I hear stories like this all the time from professors, but they don't want to go public about it. What made Laura Kipnis different is that after 72 days of putting up with the stuff she wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education about my Title IX odyssey, my Title IX witch hunt experience, and once she wrote about it publicly, about how bad it was, as we found many times at Fire, suddenly Northwestern discovered, oh, I guess you can't really find someone guilty of violating Title IX for writing an op-ed critical of Title IX. So they undid the punishment, and so, hooray, good news. But the story gets a little weirder and a little more recursive. It turns into kind of like an Escher painting by the end of it. She wrote a book about her experience called Unwanted Advances, which I absolutely recommend to everyone. It's a riveting, kind of horrifying read, where she talks more in depth about what she found out about the process and how secretive it is and how hard it was to get justice and how hard it was to investigate. And so she wrote a book also about how she felt that a lot of this overgrowth was harming freedom of speech. And she was once again investigated for violating Title IX by Northwestern University for publishing the book. The investigations were dropped, the lawsuits were dropped. There's one remaining defamation suit against her for what she wrote, which I think is not going to succeed, but it's an amazing story. I do really recommend Unwanted Advances. So the professoriate, how is this a factor? Partially it's because not everybody, but I get this a lot, particularly from conservatives. They think that the real problem on campus are those liberal professors. They're tyrannizing the students, and the problem's really coming from them. And that really has not been my experience. Unfortunately, at Stanford, one of my professors was a guy who wrote the speech code for the law school, and I was kind of embarrassed for him because it got shot down so easily in a court of law. But mostly, I find that the professors are actually on the receiving end of a lot of this stuff. And some of it, and here again, how things don't fit the stereotypes. Now, this is a case, and I'm focusing particularly on cases that I think, one, don't fit stereotypes, but two, also I think are horrifying. And this should have been in the news everywhere, because this is a case in which there were two sort of gadfly professors at Chicago State University. And they were constantly saying, this place is horribly run, this place is corrupt, this place is bankrupt. Unfortunately, all kind of true. And they were investigated multiple times. The university kept on going through different ways to shut them down. One of the first ones was saying that this is a trademark violation to mention Chicago State University or use pictures of the campus. Not going to fly. The next one was cyberbullying, which was adorable, because they passed a cyberbullying policy saying that these guys are cyberbullying the president of Chicago State University, as if it's like a junior high school person that's being attacked. It's like, oh my goodness. And so we litigated this case for a long time, but the most horrifying thing that came out of it was that there was one professor was approached and asked to file false harassment charges against these two professors. She was willing to quit over that, which is a real testament to her. And another administrator was asked to file false harassment charges against these professors, and she was fired. And she actually submitted an affidavit. The other professor sued, by the way. And what's so amazing about this is, and one of the reasons why the litigation went on so long was because by the time we were actually getting to the settlement stage, Chicago State was pretty close to bankrupt. So maybe they should have listened to the two professors who were telling them that you're corrupt and heading towards bankruptcy. But the idea of actually setting up people to sort of put false allegations, that should have been national news. But because this didn't fit a narrative of political correctness, this one just didn't get any legs, which I think is really interesting. I think everyone should know that my experience from working on campus is weirdly that if a story fits sort of a conservative sort of political correctness run amok scenario, it's not only better picked up by, of course, Fox News, but also picked up by the liberal media more, or liberal-leaning media more. When I have cases in which liberals get in trouble, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, it's amazing how little coverage they get. And when there's no political valence, when it's just people being screwed over for being, for things as old as time, being critical of Dean Wormer, it seems to go nowhere. So anyway, it's something that I really think is quite remarkable. And one thing I do want to lean at, there are cases that look a lot like the stereotype. I want to be very clear about that. It's not as if political correctness cases don't happen, or conservative professors get in trouble. But this one, even this one, kind of defies some of the stereotypes. This is a professor at Marquette University in Wisconsin, a Catholic university. He runs a blog in which his usual complaint is that my Catholic university doesn't allow people to have Catholic points of view. That essentially I'm a conservative Catholic, and at this school you're not actually allowed to take positions that Catholics believe on things like same-sex marriage or abortion, etc. And he had a student approach him who taped a discussion with a junior, sort of a professor in training, who was doing a debate class, and he taped her, which is not, doesn't exactly, cover the student in glory, but taped her saying, we can't debate gay marriage in this classroom because it would be offensive and homophobic and all these different reasons why it would be. And that was exactly what John McAdams had been saying forever. It's like, listen, the Catholic Church opposes same-sex marriage, and we're not even allowed to debate it in a Catholic school. And that's what he wrote on his blog. And like I said, this took off. This was huge because Fox News jumped all over it and was all over the place. But it was a factually accurate blog. Actually, for John McAdams, it was pretty tame. And what do you think the university did in response to that? I guess you can kind of read the slide. They fired him. They fired him because the professor and the university started receiving a lot of hate mail and saying, "Oh, you typical liberal, blah 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 blah." But amazingly, they fired McAdams. And when again, all he had done is publish something absolutely true to his blog. Interestingly, even though it's sometimes hard to litigate against private schools, a appellate court in Wisconsin demanded that he be returned to campus. He actually got his job back through lawsuit against a private school, which is not easy, by the way. And I think he was just back on campus maybe last fall, which must have been extremely awkward given, I think 100 of his compatriots, of his fellow professors had signed, articles condemning him. So yeah, the conservative getting in trouble for conservative points of view does happen, but even then, at a Catholic school, there's a little bit of a twist on it that you might not expect. So this brings me to the trend that has me the saddest and most frustrated. This might be a surprise to you, but working on campuses, the best constituency for free speech on campus for my entire career up until around 2013, 2014, were the students themselves. Particularly non-traditional age students, poor students, minority students. They seem to get free speech. They seem to get due process in a way that professors often didn't, which is kind of amazing, and certainly, unfortunately, better than administrators did. This is something we could take for granted on campuses all the way up till around 2013, 2014. And then seemingly overnight, I don't know what happened. That's what the book is actually, Coddling the American Mind is actually trying to get to the bottom of what was so different about the entering class that came in right around 2012, 2013. Because it was, for those of us who work on the ground, it wasn't subtle. It was like someone turned on a switch. And something that this is actually slightly before that trend began, but I just have to share this one because this is a case involving conservative speech. This is a protest of Roe v. Wade at Dartmouth College. Again, Dartmouth College. And they're little American flags. The idea is protesting what they believe are the souls lost due to abortion. And why are some of them knocked down? Because the student drove his car. He didn't like this display, so he drove his car over this display. I see lots of cases of students, and sometimes professors actually destroying pro-life displays, very much like this one. But one of the reasons what makes this case just irresistible, not to mention, is the student had a coexist bumper sticker on the back of his car while he was doing donuts around someone's free expression, and I'm like, you're not really getting the concept here. So 2013, 2014, we started seeing a lot more shout downs. We started seeing a lot more disinvitation pushes. We started hearing about things like trigger warnings and microaggression policies, and they were coming from the students themselves, and it was very strange. And then in 2017, things got even hotter. This is where you see Berkeley riots. We spend a lot of time talking about those in the book because they were much worse than I thought. The students, and there were students involved in this, by the way. Students were gloating about being involved in this. And you wouldn't know that by hearing what Berkeley said. It's like, oh no, students weren't involved in this. And they're incredibly lucky that nobody was killed. One of the situations was, and there's video of this, is a young woman in her 20s and her husband being hit with a 20-foot-long flagpole, one right across the face, one right on the top of the head, huge pool of blood. Looked to me like when they got hit, I'm like, that person's dead. There's no way that person survived. And it actually turned out he did. He was unconscious for a couple hours, which is horrifying. This girl here is not committing the sin of wearing a Make America Great Again. She's actually wearing a Make Bitcoin Great Again, a little ironic Silicon Valley joke. And she's being interviewed live on TV. What she just finished saying, in this picture right here, what she just finished saying was, I really respect the peaceful protesters. It's a shame that so many of these violent protesters are here. And almost perfectly on cue, an Antifa person jumps out of the audience and maces her live on TV. There were journalists who were assaulted during this. And that was the thing that was interesting, is that it was nominally about Milo, but the people who ended up getting hurt in it were a lot of times just people there who were, reporters or just there to see what the hell was happening. We talk a lot about it in the book, and the scariest thing was that the Daily, I forget what the name of the student newspaper at Berkeley is, they did a whole issue of students saying, well, having this provocateur come to campus is like violence upon us, so our violence was actually self-defense, which was some of the more chilling stuff I've written, because as soon as you actually break down that idea, that great idea in the First Amendment, an idea, by the way, that was really pioneered by Frederick Douglass, that we have to decide, we have to create an invention, we have to create a machine that separates opinion from action. What they were doing was going back not to something new and innovative. They were going back to that human history that I talk about, saying that words are indistinguishable from violence, and therefore we should address mean words with violence, which is a disaster. That is a formula for lack of innovation, of course, at minimum, but also, war, death, and all of the horrible things in human history that we tried to undo with the First Amendment. And most recently, Sam Abrams at Sarah Lawrence, this is going on as we speak. This is a professor who did nothing more than write an article in the New York Times, not a respected journal you might have heard of, and he wrote about how although it's taken for granted, and this is empirically just a fact, that professors on college campuses lean decidedly to the left. That's not even controversial anymore. But what I thought was even less controversial from all the evidence I'd seen was that administrators actually lean even more so. And he wrote about this having done research. This is empirical research that he did in the New York Times. And you would think he had written Mein Kampf or something, given the reaction to it. This was, a note on his door. The students were vandalized the door. The president, quietly asked him if he wanted to go to another university. Students took over the president's office. They had a list of 90 demands, including getting rid of this horrible transgressive professor, Sam Abrams, particularly for that perfectly reasonable article he wrote in the New York Times. Unfortunately, and this is something I don't like to, I try to avoid making fun of the students, but as my co-author Jonathan Haidt pointed out, they made 90 demands, and the third one was for unlimited fabric softener, which was like, okay, if you want to be taken seriously on something, don't make that your third demand. It was, not good PR for the students. But there are also, this was the most recent trend when we wrote about coddling, when we finished coddling the American mob, is that now I'm seeing more of the conservative outrage mob coming out and becoming a real factor when professors say things both on and off campus, whether they say it on Twitter. Can everybody still hear me? Am I coming in and out? Okay, good. So conservative outrage mob, and I am actually pretty outraged about this, that this doesn't get more coverage. This is Professor Lisa Durden. Oh, sorry, that's former Professor Lisa Durden. She made a mistake, probably, and decided to go on Tucker Carlson's show to debate him about a Black Lives Matter party. She was a professor at a school in New Jersey. She wanted to debate about a Black Lives Matter party that was open only to black students. This was not a school that she taught at. This was not a school she attended. But she wanted to go on, like, I'll take on Tucker Carlson, whatever. And it's, it was kind of funny back and forth. She was actually pretty good at it. And she was fired because the university was afraid of all the hate mail they started getting about Lisa Durden. And they were getting phone calls, and they were getting mean tweets. Lisa says she got death threats, and they were afraid that it was just going to get worse. But we did a Freedom of Information request lawsuit, and we found out that they only got one nasty email. It turned out not to be, like a lot of these controversies that faded pretty quickly. But they fired her almost immediately. And I always like to point out this case because she was actually fired. She was actually fired very quickly, clearly for protected speech, and this does not get picked up in the media. This one got a little bit more coverage. This is Jim Livingston. He also a professor of the left. He complained about white gentrification of Harlem, and he was really annoyed by some what we consider to be privileged white kids acting like jerks. And he ranted a little bit about it on Facebook. And white students at Rutgers brought him up on charges of harassment for being offensive on Facebook. I've seen a lot more cases like this. Eventually, partially with Fire's help, they dropped the charges, and Jim still has his job. But it was definitely sort of another change that I've seen. And this is what I really want to emphasize. This is all happening at the same time. Like when I talk about administrators creating some problems, when I talk about the right and left wing, frankly, outrage mobs on Twitter, and then sometimes you have to sort of be mindful of the students in your class, is that all of this is still happening at the same time, and that makes my job, frankly, a lot harder. And I say this all the time. I don't envy professors right now, because they've always had to worry about what the public relations office thinks. That's always been the case my whole career, that if they say something that embarrasses the university, good luck, you're probably going to need fire to help you out. They've always had to worry about what the general counsel's office thinks, that if someone can argue that this is discrimination or somehow offensive in a way that they think is actionable, the lawyers will come in, and particularly with the Department of Education stuff, the lawyers got much more prominent in these cases, and usually on the side of censorship. But now, more recently, you have to worry about what the most sensitive student in your class thinks, or for that matter, what the student who's least tolerant of you in your class thinks, because we give a lot of sort of credence to what students complain about when it comes to subjective feelings. And then you also have to worry about the entire internet, like I said before. And this puts professors in a pretty rough position, and I feel badly for professors. Probably the ultimate case that kind of explains all of these trends happening at the same time. How many here have heard about Brett Weinstein's case at Evergreen State University? Okay, so this case started out by someone making the social science true argument that the more you actually do to separate black students from other students, the more you're actually going to increase a sense of us versus them, tribalism. It prevents reconciliation, it prevents friendships from forming, all this kind of stuff, because the school had decided, amazingly, to go from having a program called the Day of Absence, where all the black students leave campus, and to try to have the rest of the campus kind of feel what it's like not to have them on campus. And they're like, hey, why don't we just do this exactly the other way? Why don't we have all the white students get off campus? And Brett Weinstein was like, that's not going to help. Like, that's how you actually foster division. And when it comes to the actual social science behind it, yes. If you basically, you can make people feel like they're on other teams by, and this is, psychology is kind of like the other thing I get really excited about. If you give them a red shirt and a blue shirt, and it's amazing like how quickly you can make people be like, those freaking red shirt jerks. It takes like seconds before they actually start having group affinity. And the idea that this wouldn't actually create more animosity than it cured, he was right. And this just blew the hell up, and it just went on and on. Read the book. We did a lot of original reporting on it, but then it also, towards the end, started having a conservative backlash that right-wingers started calling in death threats. It was basically every single thing that I've seen going wrong in one single case. Definitely read about it. So now I'm going to move on a little bit more to the sort of the kind of nerdy, fun part of my work. I've always had an intense interest in psychology. I read a lot about it, and I was very lucky to become friends with Jonathan Haidt, who is a pretty famous social psychologist. I approached him around 2014 when we started seeing these new student illiberalism trends, and basically said, like, not only am I worried about this from a free speech standpoint, I also have noticed that the students are saying, not just, that guy can't come to campus because he offends me. They were saying, that guy can't come to campus because it's going to mentally harm me. That it's actually going to traumatize. And actually, no, they don't usually say me. They say them. Not me. I'm not all that fragile. But those people over there, those people are going to be harmed. They're going to be harmed psychologically and medically. And I heard this, and I'm like, I have had issues with depression and anxiety my whole life. And cognitive behavioral therapy saved my life. And the way that you do cognitive behavioral therapy is to, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, is to recognize what are called cognitive distortions. Oh, it didn't go. Okay. Arguing Towards Misery. This is the article we mentioned in the beginning. I wanted to give it the much more boring name of Arguing Towards Misery. And cognitive distortions are basically mental exaggerations that every single one of us makes. But amazingly, a very effective form of therapy is to identify when you're doing these sort of exaggerated thoughts and learn, and it doesn't work if you just understand this intellectually, by the way. Get in the habit of talking back to them, of saying, like I always give the example of you go on a date, it doesn't quite work out, and in the cab ride home you're going, I'm gonna die alone. And you're probably, that's probably catastrophizing. That's a bunch of things, by the way. That's mind reading. Maybe actually she thought it went okay, which does happen sometimes. Like, you think the date was horrible, and it's like, oh, that was really interesting. At least I get that sometimes. Fortune telling, that this will go poorly, catastrophizing, all discounting positives, all this kind of stuff. All these mental habits that we all engage in. It turns out if you can actually intercept them and get in the habit of intercepting them, you can actually fight anxiety and depression. And I can say from my personal experience, like I said, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not being melodramatic. It literally saved my life. And what I came to John to talk about was just the idea is, like, not only are we teaching them bad habits of freedom relating to freedom of speech, we're teaching them the habits of anxious and depressed people. So we should expect to see an increase in anxiety and depression, which we thought would be modest, which we thought there'd be a little bit of it. Oh, here are more cognitive distortions. Tell me if you see this on campuses. Overgeneralizing. Dichotomous thinking. Dichotomous thinking is us versus them, everything's binary, everything's 0, 1, you're either with me or against me. Emotional reasoning, inability to disconfirm, blaming. Emotional reasoning, by the way, just to explain what it means, And this is something that's actually very difficult for almost anyone who hasn't studied either Stoicism or Buddhism, is that essentially your emotional states are kind of like weather. Sometimes you have them for good reasons, sometimes you have them for reasons that are way in the back of your head that you don't fully understand. A lot of times your emotions are telling you things that you think are one thing, but as you look into more, they're actually telling you something very different as you give it more time and distance and thought. And when you look on campuses, there are a lot of sort of like, oh, but you feel anxious right now. Oh my God, we have to stop that. When actually what's going on is not necessarily that we have to figure out a way of always stopping anxiety. Actually, there are times where you have to learn to live with it or interrogate it. That's what campuses are supposed to be about. And so yes, I came to John with this idea. We wrote an article in 2015 called Coddling the American Mind, a title I hate, by the way. I wanted to call it, as I had on that previous slide, Arguing Towards Misery, which is incredibly boring, and I got totally overruled. Coddling the American Mind, though, became the second most read article in the history of the cover story in the history of Atlantic, at least for a while, which is pretty good, given the Atlantic has been around since 1857. It was like kind of crazy that people responded to it so strongly. But John and I kind of were like, okay, we've made our argument. We think things are pretty good, you know, like we got it all out there. And, you know, we solved the problem on campus. No, I'm just kidding. Things got much, much worse. And while we were like going back to our daily work, things were blowing up all over the place. And a lot of the things we labeled, you know, in 2015 were at the heart of these. So we got together and we wrote a book, which I wanted to call Disempowered. And I was overruled again, this time actually literally by the distributors. The distributors are like, we're not going to sell your boring titled book. We're sticking with Coddling the American Mind. And I have to explain why I don't particularly like coddling. It's because it reads to students as if what we're saying is that they're spoiled. And that's really not what we're saying. What we're saying is in a lot of cases, these students, particularly the kind that go to the elite colleges that have these problems more dramatically than anywhere else, is that they're almost like perfectly designed, you know, heat-seeking missiles. They've been trained since they were like to have 11 extracurriculars and to have perfect A's and to play the piano and the bassoon and speak ancient Greek, all of these kind of things, but they're not taught, they don't have a lot of free time for play. They don't have a lot of time to actually develop the kind of capacities that make you feel like you have what's called in psychology a locus of control. That if you don't know how to do things, basic things for yourself, and if you don't have the option of doing basic things for yourself, that is a formula, that is like a surefire formula for depression and anxiety. They've tested this in a variety of different ways. Even when they go to senior citizens homes, old folks' homes, they've done experiments where they've given, and I feel bad for the ones in this group, they tell elderly people, this will be the time you have visits. This will be the time. This will be where you'll be eating, and we're putting a plant in your room, but we'll take care of it. The other scenario where they actually do the where they do the kind of the opposite. They say you can choose where you want to meet. You can choose your visiting time, and here's a plant. Take care of it. The outcomes are amazing because you end up having not only are the ones in the more autonomy, the more locus of control group happier, their health outcomes are better. So like this is replicable, and this is something you also can intuit, that essentially if you've ever really felt like I'm not competent to do this on my own, you know what that anxiety and fear is like. And that's why it's so sad when I talk to people like Julie Lithcott-Hames, who wrote a wonderful book called How We Raise an Adult, who was the freshman dean at Stanford, and she saw these like genius kids come in, but they needed to have their parents on the phone the whole time to make basic decisions because they weren't used to it. And that's the thing, like I said, I don't like about coddling is because I'm not making fun of them. It makes me sad that someone has done something clearly with compassion, clearly with an eye that they want to protect and love their baby children, which I get. I have a 1 and 3-year-old that I'm over the moon about. I understand the instinct. But what we're doing is we're disempowering them. We're taking away the activities, the skills that actually make you feel like a human being, feel competent. So that's a lot of what the book is about, and the way we frame it is essentially, it's as if we are giving a generation the worst possible advice you could ever imagine. So we have a little bit in the beginning of the book about going up to see to see an oracle to give us wisdom, and he tells us, well, there's 3 things. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. And we're like, and, you know, John and I, like, we write about reacting to this, like, that's like the worst advice I've ever heard in my life. That's the middle one is the most attractive one, but as I explained from emotional reasoning, part of becoming an adult is you don't always immediately react to your feelings, and sometimes your feelings, frankly, aren't right. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker, of course. You know, we call that safetyism in the book. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. You know, I think a lot of people believe that. That's an old Manichaeist thought. It's not a formula for living effectively in a pluralistic democracy. And so, whereas a lot of people, they hear what we call the great untruths, and they go, well, that's the worst advice I've ever heard. And I'm like, great. Then why are we giving this advice to our children? And then we proceed in the book to explain in different ways, like whether we know it or not, we're actually teaching them these dysfunctional messages, these unhealthy messages, these messages for a less full life, without knowing it. And sometimes I think more directly than we think. So anyway, we predicted in 2015, actually really 2014, that there'd be an increase in anxiety and depression on campus among this age group. And then we found out the numbers were much worse than we thought. And we're talking here about, I'm only just going to show a couple of surveys, but self-reports of anxiety and depression, self-reports of universities reporting about how many visits people do to the psychological services. You know, we're talking about 2 or 3 times what they were in 2012. So we're talking about like from 2016 to 2012, there's a dramatic spike in all of these conditions, and we're trying to get to the bottom of like where this is coming from. And part of it, we do think, is this great untruth, the idea of teaching people dysfunctional sort of anti-CBT. And the numbers just were worse and worse, and all of the trends are going towards higher anxiety and depression, particularly among people who would have been entering college right around 2013, 2014. And the scariest one, now of course, sure you're talking about, you know, all these different clinical centers. And this we knew back in 2015, that university psychological services were completely overwhelmed. And they were saying that we're overwhelmed, by the way. And it actually, and to a degree, some of the students who were the most passionate about social justice were the ones who seemed to be having the hardest time. And we knew this, but one of the criticisms people would say is like, oh, maybe this is just students are more comfortable going to psychological services, maybe they're just more comfortable with mental health issues. That didn't really ring true to me, because I think students were actually really I didn't notice the big stigma around this in 2011 as opposed to 2014. That didn't seem to explain enough of it. But the really sad stat that indicates that it's something very real is going on here that's beyond just comfort with reporting yourself is that the suicide rate has gone up quite a bit. So what we see for men is, and actually if you compare the suicide rate between for the first decade of this century to men, it's not actually up 12%, it's up 25%, just in the last 2 years. That's bad. That's not, the 25% increase is really bad, but it's up 70% for girls. We speculate a lot of why this is in the book. We think it's we do actually think social media has a big part to play in it. We do think that that's partially because sort of like the relational aggression of junior high school. The way I put it to really explain it very quickly is imagine the worst aspects of junior high school, the absolute worst of it, then imagine it 24 hours a day for the rest of your life. And that kind of brings it home. And that's what we're hearing also in self-reports of what's going on. And we do think at the same time we're dealing with this more emotionally, this generation with higher rates of anxiety and depression, and then we're telling them that, oh, and by the way, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Life is basically you're in an irredeemable system. You are both oppressed and oppressor, and there's literally nothing you can do about that. It's, in my opinion, kind of cruel what we're doing to a generation, and I think we're actually making it worse. But you know, we've seen trends also go down, so hopefully we can contribute to improving that. So I always give metaphorical homework. I have to start saying metaphorical because one time a slide got out of me showing one of these as homework, and someone said, you know, I also teach First Amendment law. Like, how dare you tell people to do this in your class? But I'm like, no, I don't mean real homework. I mean homework for, if you choose to do it. Northern Michigan University, the yellow light school, like I said, not that bad, but we'd be happy to work with you to make you a green light rating. That's where, we're watchdogs, so we're tough on schools that violate free speech, very nice to ones that are good on it. And schools will find, actually, if they get rid of their speech codes and they host debates, that people are going to come out of the woodworks that they weren't expecting, saying, good job, way to go. And this has happened at schools across the country. I always recommend that people adopt the Chicago Statement, which is a great statement. I'm very proud to say I got consulted on it when it came out, about academic freedom on campuses. That's updated for the age of Twitter and outrage mobs and microaggressions. Teach students about academic freedom and free speech during freshman orientation. This is when conservatives in particular are like, oh, there's nothing to be done on campuses. I'm like, we haven't even done the basic stuff. Most schools don't teach about academic freedom and free speech during orientation. That's when you need to hear it. That's when you need to explain it. You need to explain, put on your anthropologist hats, put on your scientist hats, be curious about each other. And the second part is actually, and it looks like the population here is a combination of students, and this is something that I'm increasingly I feel like I'm having to say to students. Homework part 2 for students, which is argue fairly with yourself. That's what CBT is about. It's a great habit to learn, even if you're not anxious and depressed. It's a wonderful tool to learn actually how to argue fairly with yourself. But also, argue fairly with others. It's one of the reasons why I love CBT is because it actually, the cognitive distortions that it says don't do these things internally, it will make you happier. Also don't do these externally, or at least try to avoid doing these externally. No ad hominems. I just have to say this flat out. I am really, really tired of what I call the perfect rhetorical fortress. Campuses have used incredible amounts of IQ and cognitive energy to figure out a system of argumentation that will allow you to never actually address the substance of someone's argument based on a series of arguments that allow you to just talk about someone's identity, talk about some other topic, basically find a way to not talk about it. It's amazing how sort of like beautiful in its perfection the perfect rhetorical fortress is. And the way you address it is address people's arguments. The old-fashioned idea that kind of like, you're not taking on my argument. Be prepared to fight for your own freedom of speech and, more importantly, the speech of others. I'm moving on to more advanced techniques here. It is easy. It's like cheating to defend your own freedom of speech. Everybody believes in their own freedom of speech. Nope. Nobody, I think, instinctively believes in that guy over there's freedom of speech. And defending the freedom of speech that you actually don't agree with is something rightfully considered noble, or at least it used to be. And the last one, that I feel like a starry-eyed Pollyanna recommending it now these days, but I still believe in it. Make it a lifelong habit to seek out smart people with whom you disagree. I think campuses, unfortunately, have done a lousy job of this. Maybe Northern Michigan does a better job than others. I've been at schools where, my trip to Haverford was just depressing. They heard this, basically it was like, talk to heretics? Whereas, and I was talking a lot about the value of unintermediated interaction between students. I think that sometimes the attempts to make interaction between students smoother and less eventful actually results in people not actually being friends with people who are different from them, which is very sad because that was actually so much part of the college experience when I was younger. And some of the best programs, by the way, for overcoming polarization, they're as simple as, and there's this beautiful program in which they have very liberal Amherst, Massachusetts, have a selection of people who go and visit coal mining Kentucky and vice versa to talk to each other. But the way they do it is, you're going to sit down and you're going to explain to me where you're coming from, and I'm not going to say a damn thing, and you're not going to try to convince me. You're just going to tell me your point of view. And this kind of stuff is really, really powerful. It really actually makes the other person human. And once you give up trying to persuade them, you become a better scholar, which is really what we should be training. The idea of, like, when I talk about putting on your anthropologist hat, put on your scientist hat, be curious about where this person is coming from. And I see so little of that sometimes on campuses where it should be the norm. So in conclusion, I went a little bit long. Oh no, actually no, I'm pretty, only still less than an hour. This is what's at stake. This is a quote from FIRE co-founder Alan Charles Kors. A nation that does not educate in liberty will not long endure in liberty and will not even know when it is lost. That last part I see all the time. I see it from everything from people's interactions with police officers, that they don't actually know what their rights are, to freedom of speech. People who actually believe that I have a right to freedom from speech I don't like, which is just completely turns it on its head. And I see it, it's a concern. In my short book, Freedom from Speech, although I think I'm temperamentally optimistic, although maybe a Russian optimist, which to most people would be sort of like a optimism tinged with the pessimism of how awful people can actually be, that I do think that a lot of the things because some things in the world are actually getting better, that our respect for freedom of speech is actually going to get worse. As we get more comfortable, as we get more capable of watching media that just already fulfills what we already believe, to make our echo chambers ever thicker, I think it's actually going to be a challenge to maintain some of these civic and what I believe are personal virtues. That it can only be fought from a standpoint of values ultimately, that just like James Madison wanted, that essentially freedom of speech and rights will endure only if they're in the hearts of the citizens, not just if they're words on paper. So this is my contact information. That's my Twitter handle. Shoot me an email. I can't promise I'll get back to you right away, but I will definitely try. Thank you.
Folks, I'm sure you have questions. Please feel free to line up at the mics and take your turn.
Good evening, sir. My name is James Pridemore. I'm a senior here at Northern Michigan University.
How you doing?
With the rise of banning speakers at university campuses, we're also seeing the rise of the heckler's veto. You touched on this briefly, but
yeah.
Is the heckler's veto free speech, or
No.
is it another... Okay.
Sorry, is a heckler's veto free speech? I'm very, very firm on this. And it's kind of funny, because we had a case, what was it? UC Irvine. It was a Muslim student group that had some hadiths, which are sort of interpretations of the Quran, up on the website. And David Horowitz's group wanted them to take them down because some of them, they said, were anti-Semitic. And we defended the students in that case to say, listen, this is historical, this is part of their faith, they absolutely can have these up. But later, when Michael Oren came to speak at UC Irvine, the same student group organized to every 10 minutes shout down Michael Oren, so much so that they had to, he's the ambassador, he's the ambassador to the US from Israel, he's Israeli. And it was it was a constant attempt at a heckler's veto, and absolutely, in my opinion, beyond the pale. And they called me, which I think was a compliment, because they wanted us to defend their right to shout down Ambassador Oren. And it was just kind of like, guys, you were on the wrong side of freedom of speech here. You don't get the right to shout people down. Now, of course, like people, whether they're doing the snapping thing that people like to do, or some amount of heckling. But if your goal is to say that you other people cannot hear this speaker, no, that's not okay. And I see this time and time again, unfortunately, and much more recently. And this is where it really began, was people standing up and just, maybe 10 people in the room deciding that they're just going to shout until this person shuts up. And we've seen an increase in it this month, by the way. One of the most ridiculous cases, of course, being a speaker who was at Portland State University, or University in Portland, and it was just one dude dancing around with a cowbell, like in front of like this thing, and it's like, University police, I think you can stop the guy dancing around with a cowbell. I think you can handle that without everything going to hell. But yeah, we've seen an uptick in heckler's vetoes just in the past month across the country, unfortunately. And no, they're not okay. As I say, the government, part of the First Amendment, but also part of the principle of freedom of speech, is you both have to stop the government, of course, from infringing on your rights, but you also have to prevent mobs from infringing on people's rights as well. I think you. Oh, okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't really know how to put this. I think in my experience, I certainly felt like I am actually a graduate. I graduated a few years ago.
What'd you study?
I've actually got a degree in music.
Music.
So
okay.
yeah.
I don't know much. What was the environment like?
There's a few people who are certainly, when you put on like those like, what was it, cognitive training or cognitive things like
Yep.
blaming others or certain things. I noticed that I was kind of victim to that myself. I would have practice on certain things like,
Yeah.
as soon as
Everybody does it, by the way.
right. As soon as I got a job like off campus, I've been working at Jimmy John's for 3 years.
Yep.
As soon as I got that, I started immediately started desensitizing.
Absolutely.
As I got on, I started to get like more like relaxed and just sort of like just get the workday done.
Yeah.
Do you think something like that will happen to like people that like as soon as once they graduate and actually get into the workforce, maybe that will like these sensitivities will go down, or will they get worse,
Yeah.
or will it just depend on who's who?
Okay. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic question. Now, I get this a lot, and it's usually in the form of kind of like, what are these snowflakes going to do when they hit the real world? It usually sounds like that to me. I don't like the term snowflakes, by the way. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but the response is, unfortunately, I think they're going to change it in a way that you might not like. And what I'm hearing from, and what John in particular works at the business school at NYU is hearing, is that particularly from some of these elite colleges, and I can't unfortunately say what law firm this is, but I had a friend of my wife come to me and like, I want to talk to you about your book, and I knew she was very like, she ran this like really, in my opinion, awesome legal aid organization that did direct services. And I was like, oh, she's going to hate me. She's like, this is going to be bad. My wife's friend's going to like rip me a new one. And instead she came and said, we're paralyzed by the fact that we have these students who showed up from some of these elite colleges, and the entire debate in the camp within the organization is about them now. And it's about how other people offended them, and about how other people said wrong things, and about how, and they go to HR instead of actually solving it among themselves. And I'm hearing this from people kind of like all across the country, and I'm like, that's more what I was afraid of saying. But there's another point that you make, which is about what about having a good working class job? What about actually? And I was bottom quartile when I was a kid. I started working in restaurants when I was 11, and my holy terror when I was at Stanford was to point out how often truth, coincidentally, looked like what the rich white opinion was. And they hated me pointing this out, but actually rich white liberal opinion looked like. And I'd come from working with inner city high school kids in DC, and when they would talk about the speech they wanted to ban, I was like, have you ever been around middle class, lower class kids? Because like the way they talk to their best friends would get them banned from the school, for God's sakes. But that's one of the reasons why I think if you look at the discussion on identity politics on campus, class has largely fallen out of it. And there's a good reason for that, is that class will always, people, and this is something, my mom's British, and this is very strong, people from different classes than the ruling elite tend to actually purposely take on ways of talking that show that they're real and they're not like those assholes up there in the upper class. And this is a dynamic that takes place in situation after situation. And I have to feel like I have to be like a class translator in some of this stuff. I remember some jackass saying kind of like, oh, they just don't have the vocabulary for it. It's like, oh no, they talk about deep things. They just use smaller words and more inflection. But class has fallen out of it partially because they know that what they don't want to accept in some of these places, and this is what I was saying at Haverford, it's like, guys, do you realize that you're acting like a very uptight, conformist finishing school? And someone was like, well, this is, how can you, how could a school actually be acting like this? And it's like, well, because you're an upper class conformist finishing school. Just your norms, your Victorian norms actually have new things, but they're just as intolerant as they used to be. I do think that, like, if I could wave a magic wand, everybody actually taking, and we talk about this in the book. One thing that was a surprise that I didn't expect to be so adamantly for was for colleges to start favoring students who do gap years. And my preferred gap year as in like you go to between high school and college. My preferred gap year, of course, would be someone actually doing a regular job, preferably in a different part of the country. But I've heard of people doing gap years where they do like I did refugee work in Eastern Europe, and that definitely changed the way it changes your perspective on stuff. I became really a strong advocate of that because I think it actually can give you a sense of the larger world that can be very healthy to the way things work on campus. The experience of working at Sushi Yoshi, where I worked when I was 11, or working at Jimmy John's can bring a kind of common sense to some of this stuff, and because a lot of times the sort of upper class kind of norms that you see on these campuses, they think that they're speaking for the little guy. Oh, I'm going to give an obnoxious singer. and I couldn't help it. I lived in San Francisco in the late 90s, and I worked at the ACLU, and I went to Burning Man like 7 times, and I was like those guys. But I missed Washington, D.C., where I live now, because you could argue with anybody in Washington, D.C., and get a real argument because they knew the other side. And meanwhile, I was arguing in a backyards in San Francisco, and the way people would argue, it was just this sort of process of like, and you didn't go far enough. And it was just people sort of building on each other. There wasn't really disagreement. It was more about just showing your moral virtue. And I remember one time, after probably a little bit too much whiskey, saying, guys, this is the richest, whitest, most educated city I've ever lived in, with one exception: Geneva, Switzerland. And Geneva, Switzerland isn't under the illusion that it's down with the people. So I do think actually a little bit more class consciousness, not to be Marxist here, but like a little more class consciousness could actually improve things to a degree. And I don't think the elite colleges understand how much they're acting like the typical sort of upper class Victorians. Anyway, I can go on about class stuff all the time. Thank you so much. Hi.
Hey, I'm Tony Yauman. I'm from the philosophy department here at Northern Michigan University. So I guess, as befitting someone from the philosophy department, I have kind of a philosophical question for you.
I'm like, oh shit.
No, you're totally fine. I'm kind of trying.
It's not about Heidegger, is it?
No, God, no. Although we do talk about Heidegger in my existentialism class, if you want to stop
Not
by.
Hegel, though.
No, also not Hegel. I'm trying to get my head wrapped around your view on actions and words.
Sure.
In particular, I thought you were coming out against the idea that hate speech could be a kind of harm or violence.
Sure.
I thought you were against that sort of idea. And it sure makes a certain kind of common sense to say that hate speech isn't going to cause physical harm
Sure.
to someone, although it might indirectly incite it, and we could talk about that, of course.
Right. I believe it actually can cause physical harm, by the way.
But hate speech does seem like it can cause emotional harm.
Absolutely.
And that definitely seems like it's worth taking seriously.
Taking seriously, absolutely.
Right. Now,
yeah.
we shouldn't protect people from all harms all the time. That's a bad policy.
Yep.
But it does seem like there are some emotional harms caused by some kinds of hate speech that
Yep.
it might be worth protecting people from.
Yep.
That it might be a kind of, like, since it's kind of harm, might be kind of violence still. So I guess I'm
Yep.
just kind of like interested in
Sure.
where your views lie on
Yep.
speech as a kind of violence and the act-speech distinction.
This is a great question, and it's one of the things that I do a lot of debates with Stanley Fish, who's a philosopher, and the lawyer point of view, which is all about sort of messy distinctions, it never fully acceptable to him. Now he's actually studying more First Amendment law. He's kind of come around to it a little bit. It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. I've heard people present the argument on my side as if what we're saying is that speech can't harm, even badly. And my response is, oh, God, no. That's one of the reasons why I open up talking about people being burned at the stake. Make no mistake about it. Speech is a form of combat done peacefully. We've decided that speech is a legitimate way to fight things out. Now, I think that when it comes to things like hate speech, ultimately, my perspective on this is, you might call it philosophical, might call it silly, I don't know, but is that it's all about knowledge. It's all about knowing where people are coming from. And I do think that there is actual value in knowing someone's a bigot or someone's an asshole. And I think that, and the way I put it is, you're not safer for people pretending they're not bigots and that they're not assholes. And the social science on this stuff is actually even stronger than First Amendment advocates originally thought. The argument was essentially like, if you ban bigots, and that you can drive their beliefs underground where they can, quote unquote, fester. But it actually turns out that if you look at group polarization experiments, that essentially if you put people who agree with each other together, they very reliably become more radicalized in that position. It's actually like, I think of it almost like a law, close to a law of human nature. There aren't really laws of human nature, but close to it. That, because these experiments are so convincing, even just when you put people who agree with each other together for short periods of time, they tend to become more radicalized about it. So the way the speech, the way you deal with the distinction between hate speech and action is, I think, pretty well thought out in First Amendment law. And really, if you boil it down to the principles, opinions are always okay. Well, okay in the sense like they're always legitimate. You're always allowed your opinion, even if your opinion is messed up, even if it's bigoted. You're allowed your opinion, and you're allowed to say it, always, in our First Amendment law. That's very different from other countries. But actions, although in philosophical terms sometimes can be presented as if they're very hard to distinguish from speech, In the law, as a practical term, at least for most of IC, not all that hard. Because, for example, like harassment, actual harassment, which we absolutely believe at FIRE should be punished, isn't really considered a exception to freedom of speech of the First Amendment. It's just considered not speech for what I consider to be very clear reasons. It's a pattern of behavior directed at an individual that's severe and pervasive such that it denies them an educational opportunity. That is as clean as common law harassment was in the 19th century. This idea that essentially, yes, you have the right to your opinion, but do I have the right to tell you, even if I'm telling you I love you, do I have the right to tell you I love you all the time, right in your face at 3 o'clock in the morning? No, that's harassment, for goodness sakes, even if you're saying something nice. So I do actually think that the way the law distinguishes discriminatory speech and harassment, which usually covers most of what people talk about when they're talking about hate speech. But if you mean the pure expression of bigoted opinion, I'm actually the weirdo who thinks that not only is that obviously protected, and the law is very clear on that, but it's actually valuable, because people talk about this as being low value speech, but I think they're thinking about it wrong. Like I said, you're not protected for knowing less about the world. You're not protected for knowing, like as Harvey Silverglade says about it, as someone who's Jewish, I prefer to know who the Nazis in the room are. I prefer to know who I shouldn't turn my back to. And I think that we've just seen a big exercise in what happens when we think we're better off not knowing. And I was saying this all during the lead up to Donald Trump, that you're going to end up, if there's a population who's skeptical of the kind of people who would do polling, you're going to end up with results for Trump, for example, being polling actually decidedly lower. There's going to be a portion of the population that simply won't talk to them, or will lie to them, or say to their faces what they think they want the pollster wants to say. Therefore, the polls end up being way lower than we think, and we think actually there's no chance of him being elected. And I think that's actually one of the things that happened in 2016, and there's a fair amount of empirical evidence for it. So yes, the speech distinction in philosophy, I think it can be a lot harder than it can be in practical life threats, but then you end up with, in First Amendment law, categorical exceptions, which are, once again, just like Oliver Holmes said, the life of the law is experience. These include things like threats, saying, I'm going to kill you, because anything that creates a reasonable fear that I'm going to harm you physically, not protected. Defamation, not protected. Harassment, not protected. Incitement, let's go burn down this village. When there's a likelihood that you're actually going to do it, it's not protected. But it's all done in the name of trying to, one, have sensible, common sense, real-world exceptions while protecting the most plurality of opinion as possible. I think actually First Amendment does a good job of it. And most times when people actually bring me situations of, a bigot trying to harass or intimidate, it usually crosses a line in some way, whether it's stalking or actual harassment. I mean, FIRE gets cases sometimes where we're like, sorry, dude, that's freaking harassment, or that's stalking, or that's vandalism, or that's a threat. So just a little bit of a side note. It can actually be pretty funny. I actually sort of miss doing case intake for FIRE, because just like when I did it for the ACLU, you end up with these cases where you read 900 words in, it's like, I'm being persecuted for my belief in Ron Paul and blah, 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 blah. And then I just hit this dude and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, could you put the hit the dude earlier in the things so I don't have to read it? But hopefully that kind of answers your question. I do actually think that it is a tough question and a very real question. But I do think that the law gives good guidance on where the parameters should be. Oh, sir.
Hi, I'm Jim Green. I used to teach philosophy here. Let me try to encourage you to look at microaggressions and trigger warnings and all that in a more sympathetic way.
Okay. I wasn't sympathetic when I talked about microaggressions?
Not really.
Did I mention trigger warnings?
Did
you listen to my speech?
Okay, so as I see it, when you think of these things, you're looking at it from perspective of, say, of Socrates and John Stuart Mill.
Uh-huh.
Socrates in the early dialogues talks to people and aggravates them. They get all ticked off at him because he challenges their fundamental assumptions. Mm-hmm. And John Stuart Mill said, challenging one's fundamental assumptions is really good for you because you might be wrong and you discover it's right. But even if you're right, this challenges you to articulate why you're right.
That's Mill's trident.
Yeah, I got you. So that's you, and that's the strength of your position.
Okay. Really?
And let me try to suggest looking at it from the point of view of Plato and the Theaetetus.
Oof, don't like Plato, but go on.
That's okay.
I think he ruined everything, but go on.
And Alistair McIntyre If you know him
Ideas
as-
are more real than people. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, let me finish though, okay?
Sure, sure.
So Alistair McIntyre is another philosopher. So here's what they say.
Oh, no.
Plato in the Theaetetus says, we're not going to make progress in philosophy unless we're related to each other in a certain way.
Uh-huh.
He says philosophy can only be done with friends
Uh-huh.
because to really open yourself up about basic beliefs, you have to sort of trust the other
Right.
person to respect you.
Yep.
So this can only happen in a certain kind of community. He says friendship, but you get the idea.
Yeah, I get it.
McIntyre, if you know anything about him, he's a philosopher who had been a liberal and Marxist and so on. Why is he at Notre Dame now? Because for him, he felt that this kind of traditional Enlightenment liberalism, based on like John Stuart Mill or Socrates, that you couldn't get anywhere with that. And so he sees at Notre Dame, he's philosophizing now within a tradition. And that means having shared assumptions with the people that you work with.
Yep.
And so what I see going on with things like trigger warnings and so forth, people wanting to be in a community with others whom they can trust.
Yep.
As an example of this, I grew up in Chicago in the 50s,
Yep.
okay? And I went to Catholic schools. And so Catholics in the 40s and 30s, created Catholic schools. Why? Because there was certain hostility they felt in public schools. So they created not only grade schools and then high schools, but also universities, because they're a place where people could reason comfortably with people of like-mindedness. And I think, we can find the craziness in the trigger warnings and so forth about we need detergent or softener and so forth.
Sure.
Those are easy marks, you
Yep.
know. But I'm saying, you raised a very nice point earlier. You said, I'm really intrigued by how we, inadvertently offend people.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting idea. And I think you ought to look at people who are concerned with these trigger warnings and stuff, who are sensitive to that. And we've heard talks like yours tonight, and last year we've had other ones talking about trigger warnings and all this.
Yep.
But we never have anybody up here who defends that.
Yeah.
We never have a commentator
I
who
can do
would
it.
respond to you.
Yep.
And I encourage Gabe at some time in the future
Yeah.
that instead of having just another speaker about this,
Yep.
we have someone who speaks about this, but then have people who respond to that and give some kind of defense.
Huh.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you've wounded me, but I don't think you should be punished for it. I thought I was actually very sympathetic to microaggressions. I am very sympathetic to microaggressions. My joke is that, and it's true, is my mother is British and my father is Russian, and my life was one long microaggression. I do think we slight each other in a variety of ways. I think that actually when you look at the list of microaggressions that people talk about, they are sometimes things that can be very alienating, particularly as someone who is lower income coming to college. There were things that people could say that were really insulting, that were basically just assuming everybody else is wealthy. So I have genuine sympathy for it. But like I said, when it becomes actually a tool of administrators, it's no longer philosophical, it's practical, and it starts looking a lot more like the approved points of view of usually my, ironically, my upper class, wealthy, white, liberal college. So I do have sympathy for the study of microaggressions. I think that they are sullied as soon as they become speech codes. I didn't actually think I mentioned trigger warnings during this. Maybe I did. So trigger warnings, maybe. It was. Yeah, I think I mentioned it. Maybe. Okay. So here's my surprising point of view on trigger warnings, or maybe not so surprising. I've been at schools, Carleton College. A girl came up to me crying, saying trigger warnings were really important to me. I found them really helpful. And why do you think they're not good? And I think she expected me just to give some kind of like blowhard conservative answer, like snowflake, blah blah blah. Here's my answer. There is no evidence that they're actually helpful to the people that claim need them. There's none, literally none. And I am very strongly of the opinion, for all the psychology that I've read, that actually they are harmful. There have been 3 studies done. The first one, the last one's not. I can't actually. I'm limited in how much I can talk about it. There's been 3 studies done on the effect of trigger warnings. 2 show that they have no benefit. And the third, done by, I think the smartest one, done by Richard McNally at Harvard, not only show that they have no benefit, but they could actually increase anxiety for people in the classroom. unsurprisingly. Essentially, if you say, by the way, we're just about to cover something very difficult, it's kind of like the scary music playing in the audience. So that's one of the things the study showed. But even more devastatingly, about what Richard McNally said, what he found in this study was that it actually made students think, when he polled them, that they would be less resilient in the face of words and that they could be permanently harmed by words. And here's one of the things that I talk a lot about, self-fulfilling prophecies. If you believe that there's a reason why people misunderstand the whole sticks and stones idea. I've seen this ridiculous argument that people make that sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will hurt me. That just simply isn't true. Actually, it turns out names and words can hurt you. And I've seen this formulation repeated over and over again. I'm like, are you nuts? Like, basically, you don't need to give someone a mantra. You don't need to give a child a mantra to repeat that, where they say to themselves, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. If they don't actually hurt, it's a tool. It's a way of actually dealing with the reality of hurt, so it doesn't hurt you quite as much. So what we're doing, I think, actually, and sometimes with trigger warnings, is we're claiming to care about people who have PTSD. We're claiming to care about people who might be more fragile, and we're harming them, but because it feels intuitively right, and I think this happens a lot on campuses, because it feels morally and intuitively correct, we do it anyway, even though, like, so far, empirical evidence shows it's either harmful or not helpful. So I will give my opinion on trigger warnings, I was expecting to. I don't think quite as monstrous as you might guess. And again, and I've said this, and the third factor for trigger warnings is when I talk to professors, particularly if they teach difficult things, they're telling me they don't want to teach. They don't want to teach, for example, Jeannie Suk wrote an article at Harvard saying that she's approached by professors who don't want to talk about rape in criminal law classes. Rape is a major topic if you take criminal law in law schools. But partially because it's traumatic, because it's difficult to talk about, increasingly professors are kind of going, listen, we're gonna sort of step away from this. And who is harmed if lawyers know less about sexual assault? Victims of sexual assault. So it ends up having a lot of perverse outcomes. And this is kind of like what Jonathan Haidt's kind of whole idea of basically you have this sort of unipolar morality that's all about care for victims, but that is so focused that it doesn't actually have to be attached to results or empirical data, as long as you can show that you're showing care for victims and you've done the right thing. So I didn't want to talk all that much about trigger warnings, but that's my overall position on it. All right, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a senior in the education department. I'm planning on becoming a high school teacher, and I'm a little short for this microphone. I guess my question to you would be, how does what you talked about play into like the public like K-12 system versus colleges?
Oh, absolutely great. I think about this all the time, and I want to do a lot more interaction with K through 12, because I do think that we end up with the bully, the bigot, and robber baron. Sometimes I think, frankly, intentionally taught, and sometimes unintentionally taught. With most people act. I always have to say this, particularly when I talk to conservatives. It was kind of funny, that's a brief digression. Coddling the American Mind, the full title is Coddling the American Mind, how good ideas, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And when I do some more left-leaning shows, I'll get people be very mad about the coddling part. But I've done conservative shows where they get really mad about the good intentions part. Because they're like, well, liberals don't have good intentions. And it was on like drive time radio in California, and I'm like, to my host, I'm like, generally people don't get up in the morning and say, in the name of evil, follow me. So my point is that all of this overwhelmingly comes from good intentions, but you always have to interrogate your intentions on their actual results. And if your good intentions mean that people are actually, harmed by them, then, I think something different. So what can we do with K through 12? I think that there needs to be, well, for God's sakes, one thing is really clear: more civics. And there are a lot of good organizations that used to be very powerful in this space that have kind of faded from view. I've looked at some of them, and it seems like they might be a little bit outdated in their approaches. But partially with the focus on STEM, which I love STEM, but also drill and kill, which I hate. We've gotten away from civics when the justification for academic freedom and higher education and universities, at least originally, in some theoreticians' mind exclusively, is about making better democratic citizens. So I do think more focus on civics would help. I also, I'm trying creative ways to reach out to students earlier. I'm working on a graphic novel. We already have one graphic novel. I'm a comic book nerd, so this is fun. We have a curriculum that we give to students, and I think that even minimal explanation of this stuff would help. And I think that getting to students a little bit earlier would help. But I definitely would love to, but this is a place where I need more help figuring out how best to do it, because we are trying to get a lot more. We're working with the Constitution Center, for example, working with something called the Bill of Rights Institute. We're working with something called Action Civics. I'm talking to the head of there next week. But we want to do a lot more of it, because, like I said, the justification for education in a lot of ways is how to make our democracy work better. And I say this a lot. I don't actually think higher education in K through 12 is why we have such a dysfunctional society currently, but they're potentially our best remedy for it. And I don't think they're really achieving. So please be in touch, because I want to do a lot more in K through 12. And I'd love to know what you think would actually be effective to reach more people, or if you think the goal is to reach more people.
I'm actually a science teacher, so it's interesting you mentioned STEM and stuff like that.
Love it.
but,
My favorite class. What kind of science?
I'm integrated science, so I could teach earth science, I could teach chem, I could teach physics.
That's awesome.
It's a degree responding to the teacher shortage.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Lack of respect and other issues in education. Big philosophy of mine is citizen scientists and getting people to read things for knowing when graphs have been manipulated, knowing when people are interjecting their opinions and stuff. So
This is awesome, by the way. Because like, as far as things that I really would love for students to get is like, we have to rethink what makes someone a good citizen, and one thing is a better grasp of statistics, for example. So the fact you're doing that that's just amazing.
so that's more of my philosophy, but I guess I was just interested what, I guess just in general, there's a lot, education is a huge system, millions of people
Yeah.
in our country. But I think you can't address something at the college level that you aren't addressing.
Yep, agreed.
In the K-12 system in a really intentional way.
Yep.
Because when you reach, they found that like middle school is such a fertile time for strongly held opinions. And that afterwards, it kind of like becomes a really tough battle.
Becomes your identity.
Yeah, or even language. You look at people learning a language under 12 years old or over 12 years old, and how fluent they're able to become and how much they're able to engage with it. And I guess my only thing would be that I'm glad to hear you're having a K-12 focus, because you really need to have that K-12 focus.
I agree.
That would be my feedback, is that it's all well and good to prosecute things at the collegiate level and talk about the collegiate level, but you only attack the problem from the top.
Yeah.
It's like pulling out the flower and you don't pull out the roots.
I think that's totally correct, but I think you're absolutely right, and we want to do a lot more in K-12. There is one major distinction, though, about particularly First Amendment law that makes it hard to teach some of this stuff before college, is because unfortunately, due to, I think, some opinions that I think are more or less correct and some opinions that I think are very much wrong, including one involving the slogan, "Bong hits for Jesus," high school students have very few rights right now. So like the fear initially for us was teaching students about the beauty and wonder of their rights, and telling them in the same breath, oh, and by the way, you guys don't have these at all. They were taken away from you sometime over the last 30 years. And that's one of the reasons why we're hesitant to get involved, because the rights of high school students have eroded tremendously, but college students' rights are still very strong. That being said, we've gotten over that concern. We're going to try to get to people earlier. And I think you're absolutely right about when people form aspects of their identity. And I think that other aspects of the polarization of society make those identities much more like a schema, that essentially these days people wear some of their points of view a lot more like people used to wear their religion, for example. But thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Fritz Erickson. I'm one of those administrators that you have such great affection for.
That I'm pretty hard on, yeah, I know.
It's all right. My question, though, really revolves around the idea of civility.
Sure.
And how civility is or isn't a balancing factor in this. And do we, we have 1,000 people that work at this institution.
Yep.
Do we have can we have a reasonable expectation that the very notion of civility provides some balance to unencumbered free speech?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. Because I do, as my work, I'd say probably 3 very different things that sound similar. Part of what FIRE does is freedom of speech. We also do academic freedom, and we do due process. And even though those sound interrelated, they're actually quite different. in a lot of different ways. And so I absolutely, like I've already said it, I believe that there's a value in knowing someone's a bigot, there's a value in knowing someone's a white supremacist, all the value in knowing that someone is crazy and has conspiracy theories. That doesn't mean I think they're equally, so if someone gets arrested for or someone gets kicked out of school, we will defend them. However, when it comes to how you debate and how you discuss and how you get to better ideas, I have very strong opinions about how you do that and how you do that effectively. Now, but be careful about civility, because if you make a general civility code for the entire university, to go back to John Stuart Mill, whose argument I think is amazing, he says that civility tends to take on, just like I said before, the look of what the people in power, what the people who actually run the institution, for example, think is allowable. Whereas if someone says something equally, if there's some kind of objective scale of sort of obnoxiousness and ad hominem attack, that if someone says ad hominem that it doesn't agree with the politics of the university, then, oh my God, well, that guy's going to get kicked out. But if someone says something that's better reflects the point of view, the leanings of the university, as John Stuart Mill pointed out in 1859, suddenly they're like, bravo, bravo, righteous rage. I'm glad to see it. So a civility code for the entire university, no, we would oppose that. Professors having environments in their classroom, and this is something that is so basic, but people seem to misunderstand it. It's absolutely essential to academic freedom that professors can control their classrooms. That they can demand civility, that they can demand serious arguments, they can ban ad hominem attacks. They have power over their classroom, and they need to have that. I do talk about on learning liberty some abuses that professors do, but those are way outside of normal things. The one I talk about as an abuse was actually having a requirement that someone literally lobby the government for a cause, not do an exercise, but actually lobby the government for a cause he didn't believe in order to graduate. That's crossing a line. But overall, professors can control their classroom. Meanwhile, projects like I was talking about, where you just listen to people, that's great practice too. And I think that when it comes to some of the habits that sometimes are called civility, whether it's giving people the benefit of the doubt, hearing them out, trying to empathize, all these kind of stuff are great skills that universities should be teaching. But I think that it has to be done through practice in a degree, like groups, classes of actually people talking across lines and just listening. And I think that sometimes where universities get in trouble too is they intermediate it too much. They want to fix it. And I think that in some cases, just it's kind of funny because like another thing that conservatives like to complain about is safe spaces. This like as if there's one definition of safe spaces that's evil and it's coddling and it's snowflake somehow. And I've seen literally 7 different definitions of safe spaces in my life, most of which are completely unproblematic. But the one that was around when I was in college, I still really love, which was a safe space. What that meant was, in this room, we're going to listen to each other, and we're going to try not to judge, and nothing leaves this room. And that, to me, is beautiful, undermined in part by the fact that we have Twitter and nobody trusts anybody anymore. But I do think there is space for some of these virtues. However, as soon as we actually start thinking that civility is the all-purpose answer to how we actually punish people at parties who are being rude, then we have an issue with that. If people are saying there are better ways to argue, there are more persuasive ways to argue, there are better ways to get to truth, then from the academic freedom standpoint, we're absolutely with you. I think I'm almost at it. Oh, were you waiting for how much time? Okay, yeah, I think we have time.
My name is Trent. I'm a graduate.
Hi, Trent. What'd you study?
Media production.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I don't really agree with what's blown out in the media. It's like an epidemic of PC problems on campuses and such. But you brought up that there is a rise in conservative illiberalism on campuses. Why do we never hear about that as often? And usually it's always conservatives attacking liberals about this.
That's a great question, and I don't really know. It's actually something I get really pissed off about but like I actually get more angry about that big middle, where it's just administrative abuses. So like on Learning Liberty, my first book is about an environmentalist student, liberal student, but getting kicked out over a dispute about a parking garage program that he objected to on campus. And it's a long story, but it's horrifying. Almost no media traction other than things that I personally wrote in the Huffington Post to make sure that everybody knew how outrageous this case was. I am that like I said, that big middle of just abuses from administrators that are usually as old as time. But at the same time, like the Lisa Durden case is absolutely outrageous. I think in part, in that case, it's because, and this is obnoxious, but I did one article for the New York Times, one op-ed that I wrote, and it was amazing how working with their editors, it was like a little bit of a cartoon of what you'd expect, because they were saying, when I was talking about all these cases, exactly like the cases I wanted to talk about, they were saying, well, our readers really only care about the elite colleges. And I was like, I'm not going to tell you to go to hell. I really want this article to appear, but geez, wow, like that's worse than I've heard. So there is a sense that kind of like, so Rutgers maybe kind of qualified, Lisa Durden's school didn't quite qualify. But when there's, but at the same time, in other cases, I can try to explain it, but I'm also just mystified. I don't really know why some of these cases aren't even at least treated like good human interest stories. And it really is interesting to me. I think that because there is a sort of picture of political correctness run amok, and like I said, does happen, absolutely, but it's also not, it's only one part of the story, is that somehow that resonates both on the right and on the left, but the stories that don't fit that paradigm just somehow don't get noticed. And I'm trying to do my best to bring attention to this big middle of cases that are illiberal and don't get talked about. So, good question.
If I could maybe take the privilege of the last question, we're almost out of time. I value free speech, and I value civility. And I think it's an interesting question how to have both.
Yeah.
And I think we're doing it here tonight. I would contrast it, with a lot of other situations where we don't manage to have free speech and civility. If you can't question, to me, that's not civility. We've had experts come to campus and teach workshops on microaggressions. There's no questioning in those workshops. It's explained that to question the concept of microaggressions is a microaggression. Yep. And you better just get it. You're the wrong type of person if you have any questions. The atmosphere in those workshops is palpable. You know not to raise a question. It would appear rude. Even I don't ask a question in those workshops. It's just clear that it's not to be done. So, you mentioned tonight, and it's in your book on Learning Liberty, that you struggle with a wish to be polite and a part of you that wants to be outspoken.
Yeah, should I tell that story?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I'll throw it to you in a second. I promise. You said, or you may say it better than me, that you had a very polite English mother who valued politeness and a Russian father who valued frankness. I relate to that, as I told you on a drive up here from Escanaba because of the fog at Sawyer. I have two countries. I'm just here pushing for allegiance to a foreign country. I live in a country that's palpably more committed to politeness than another country where I spend part of my time. I spend part of each year in Israel. And believe me, if you ever visit, those of you who haven't, you might think it's not your definition of civility, but it is very, people are very outspoken there. And the norms are just different, is what I've noticed. So what I'm wondering is, how does FIRE and how do you think about ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, I would add cognitive diversity, even neurodiversity, given that some people are on the spectrum of autism, relate to others differently. I've always liked kind of wackos and weirdos and people who say what's on their mind, but I'll tell you, when I'm in this country, as opposed to that other one, I try my best not to offend people, and I'd like to have a robust civility where we can talk frankly about ideas, philosophy, and criticize and exchange ideas. What do you say, and what does FIRE say about cultural diversity, cognitive diversity,
Sure,
and different norms of civility?
Great question. I always wanted to write a series of articles about how censorship just doesn't go with any kind of genuine cultural diversity. And this is what I mean. Not only did I grow up with a Russian father and a British mother, I grew up in a neighborhood where a lot of the other kids were first generation, and there was no, at least in my actual neighborhood, there was no majority. Like some of the kids were from Vietnam, some of the kids were Korean. One of the white kids was actually from the South, which was like an entirely different country to me. The coolest kid on the block was from Peru, and I had this weird like Russian British hybrid thing, which is not very common. And so we all had like different ideas of like what you should be allowed to say, and like we would think of our mothers and fathers. All of our mothers and fathers had particular taboos around things that you weren't allowed to say. And the only way you could handle it when it's that diverse is everyone gets the right to say what they and to make mistakes, and that we are very patient in the face of those mistakes. So my father, when he talks about, my father speaks 7 languages, and he grew up in Yugoslavia, and he would say to me, when you go to another country and you expect them to play by your norms, you are acting like hick. In a very, very, very polite way. No definite article. Actually, the Russians don't generally use definite and indefinite articles. I remember at one point my dad was saying, "Where is cat?" And I go, "Dad, do you mean where is the cat?" And he just looks at me and goes, "Of course, I mean where is the cat?" And I was like, "Oh my God, our language is stupid." I didn't actually have to say that anyway. So the idea of sort of like anytime someone's trying to sort of impose civility or impose censorship, they have to sort of pick a culture, because there's nothing more diverse in terms of cultural diversity than ideas of what politeness norms are and what civility norms are. And not only is it different among cultures, like staring someone directly in the eye is extremely rude in some cultures. Not staring people in the eyes is extremely rude in others, for example. But also it differs from decade to decade. It differs from gender, it differs from economic class in almost every country. And so you're dealing with such a tremendous amount of diversity, so it has to be this, at best, this robust civility. Like, I'm not going to beat up Mikey Barrett every time he says something stupid. Kind of has to be the rule. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so strange that a lot of times in trying to pose speech codes, the claim is that this is to sort of foster multiculturalism, when actually I'm increasingly dealing with international students showing up from China, from Russia, from Ghana, saying, I don't know what I'm allowed to say here. It seems like I'm still trying to figure the language out, and there are landmines everywhere. And I get this increasingly at every campus I go to, that it's actually the genuinely most diverse group of students who are from all over the world who actually are the most kind of like, I don't know what to say. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm sure of it. And it was very good that you brought up neurodiversity. Because at FIRE conferences, and we have this great summer conference, if you're students, you should all look into going, at the National Constitution Center, and we have a lot of autistic kids show up, and they're or on the spectrum, or on the spectrum, and they don't know how to say it. They're completely confused by the rules, so they're very interested in speech. So I actually think that we've got it kind of upside down when it comes to multiculturalism in speech, that actually speech is demanded, freedom of speech is demanded. Now, how do you make it more civil? It has to be the other way around. It can't be, by the way, here's the 100 things that we think you shouldn't say or opinions you shouldn't have. It's got to be, I got to figure out where you're coming from, and I've got to start from a position of charity. I've got to start from assuming that you're trying to actually tell me something about yourself, and I have to start with a high level of tolerance for everything from different personalities, different levels of expressiveness, to what might be something that makes you feel awkward, but might actually be something compassionate or kind. Or suddenly discovering that, by the way, like if you like touch this student's shoulder, that's also considered incredibly rude, whereas in some cultures it might be considered extremely affectionate. So I think that in some ways there's sort of like an imperialism to sort of campus censorship that essentially doesn't recognize that it's actually kind of like it's this narrow thing, and once again acting the role of sort of like the traditional person in power. So I actually think that diversity and freedom of speech are of course related. And the civility rules have to be high levels of tolerance, high levels of forgiveness, and most of all, and the thing that before we even talk about civility, the main thing that universities should be instilling in people is curiosity. Why do you think that way? Why are you currently making me angry by your norms? Or why do I suddenly find you so strange and charming? All of these kind of genuine curiosity about people. That's why I always say, put on your scientist hat, put on your anthropologist hat, and be curious. And I think that if we had more of that as a starting point, more of that being said from the very beginning, you'd have more friends across lines of difference. You'd probably also have some more nasty fights. That's gonna happen sometimes. But I think that ultimately you'd be closer to an environment that can actually do a better job of fostering friendships across lines of difference and producing more interesting, exciting, lovely ideas. So that's kind of my hope. So when I think of that orientation, I think about it being rooted very much in ideas of multiculturalism, ideas of neurodiversity, and all this kind of stuff, but refocusing people on being curious about each other with a strong dose of compassion and a high dose of patience. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. That was fun.